as Bill will remind us again before we close today, those who physically are able to come, we'll have services next week, and want to encourage you, if you have any health concerns, whether you're old or with little bitty ones, feel free to stay home and watch the streaming, but these are kind of baby steps to getting us back to a sense of normal, and so we'll be looking forward to doing that. And again, continue to pray for Tim and his healing and his recovery, and the things that the doctors have done will help him to be restored to health as soon as possible. Today's lesson is the result of what I love to think about Bible study as a spiritual treasure hunt. And as we mentioned last week, the book of Psalms is divided into 5 different books, and you'll have book number 1, and 38 of the Psalms are written by David. And then you come to book number 2, and the early Psalms are given by the sons of Korah. And I always wonder, are they the editors of the second book? And after you have that wonderful introduction in Psalm 1, then Psalm 2 is about the king and the blessing of the king, quoted also in the New Testament. And then the last Psalm, Psalm 72, is written by Solomon, also about the king. And so this is kind of the bookends for books 1 and 2, and it's primarily having to do with the United Kingdom in the time of David, and it ends with one of Solomon's songs. When you come to book number 3, then you'll find the first group of Psalms are attributed to the sons of Asaph. And years ago, in reading through this, and again, encourage you, if you've never read 5 Psalms a day, 1 chapter of Proverbs, we're at the beginning of, you can do it anytime, but we're at the beginning of a month. And if you've never done that, really encourage you to just take the time to do that. Nourish your soul, be a blessing to your heart and your life. But I was just reading through the 3rd book one day, and here are the songs of Asaph, and I came very quickly in Psalm 74, because it starts, book number 3 starts in Psalm 73. Then you have these terms like, and I'm in 74 verse 3, or 4, thy foes have roared in the midst of thy holy place, and they set up their own signs, the upper entrance they have hacked, they have set the sanctuary on fire in verse 7. And I got to thinking, this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. David is about 1,000, and the destruction of the temple is 586. 400 to 500 years have gone by. And then when you keep reading in this 3rd book and you come to chapter 79 of Psalms, the sons of Asaph say, O God, the heathen have come into thine inheritance, and they have defiled thy holy temple, and they have laid Jerusalem in ruin. And so that started, again, what I just referred to as kind of a spiritual treasure hunt. And so I just decided I'm going to get out a concordance and just trace every time that we find the word Asaph in our Old Testament and just see where that leads me. And one of the things, and this is kind of the home base for this, I'm going to read briefly from 1 Chronicles chapter 16. And as David is bringing the ark into Jerusalem, as David is getting the worship organized and the people who are involved in the singing and the other things, you'll find all the way back in chapter 15, verse 17, oh, here's the brethren of Asaph. And then in 1 Chronicles 16, David appointed certain Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord. And notice what they're to do: to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. And Asaph was the chief. And you get to looking at this and you think, okay, when it comes to these musical families, as we referred to them, then let's call him the grandfather, talking about for multiple generations. Then Asaph is one of those first ones that are appointed involved in this. They're involved in symbols, their worship before the Lord. And I'm in chapter 16, verse 7. On that day, David first appointed that thanksgiving be sung to the Lord by Asaph and his brethren. And then when you come to the end of that chapter, then the praise is given, and I'm in 1 Chronicles 16:37. David left Asaph and his brethren there before the ark of the covenant of the Lord to minister continually before the ark as each day required. I have a very, not with me personally, but a very personal association with this. One of our team members to Australia was Charlie and Debbie Powell. Charlie took maybe 2 or 3 piano lessons and 2 or 3 guitar lessons. And as he told me one time, when I hear a melody, my right hand can play the melody and my left hand plays the harmony. And so years ago, a movie, Amadeus, came out about Mozart. If Charlie goes to that movie, he has to go early because before he can sleep that night, he has to play every note of every song that he heard in the movie before his mind will let him go to sleep, which just is kind of disgusting that someone would be that talented. But if he sits there and listens to this whole movie, then he will go home and his right hand will play the melody and his left hand will play the harmony, and he will play through the entire movie before his mind lets him go to sleep. Wintertime in Australia, the sun would go down on the 4th of July before 5 o'clock, and a lot of times we would meet at Charlie's house. We would have like a cookout, and Charlie would play guitar, but he doesn't need any music. He doesn't need to see anything, and so in the dark, I'm sure the neighbors wondered, what are those crazy Americans doing this time? But most of our 4th of Julys were spent. Like I said, it was dark by 5 o'clock, and we would have a weenie roast, a cookout in Charlie's backyard, and we would have one bracket of American songs, 4th of July, one bracket of Australian songs, and if Charlie had ever heard the song, then he could play it. So I'm not surprised when I see a son come by the piano years later and go and push a key and says, oh, that's middle C. And this musical talent, and again, not to be disrespectful, but from my generation, I refer to the family of Asaph as the Osmonds and the Jacksons of the Hebrew family. And as I went on this spiritual treasure hunt, here's the bottom line, and then we'll kind of develop this one point. When we look at the family of Asaph, we can account for 600 years of faithful worship to God. And I want you to just let that sink in. We can account for 600 years of faithfulness, and I'm not sure that we can so clearly identify that with any other family in the Bible, very specifically in terms of them and who they were and what they were called to do. And so what we're going to, and we'll do the first part briefly, and then the second part we'll be talking about us within our families. First of all, with faithfulness and worship and being with God. And that's why when our children were growing up, we had devotionals, we had a worship at home every day. And that's something that we always did within our family. And that's why Sunday was the best day of the week, because what we have been doing in our family all week long as mom, dad, and the kids, then we now get to do with the church family. And that was such a significant part of our development and our growing up of our children. And we're going to look initially at David and Solomon. They're going to be the earliest ones. But then here's what I want you to anticipate. We're just going to look at 3 other examples. But over a period of time, God's people will fall away. They will no longer keep the law. They will, in some cases, quit worshiping. And we're going to have 3 different examples, and I like to call them a restoration movement. There's a period of time, like, for example, with Hezekiah, later with Josiah, and they say, we're going to go back and do it like our father David did. And when we do it like our father David did, guess what we do? Where are the sons of Asaph? And then finally, at the very end, here's Ezra and Nehemiah. They have come back from Babylonian captivity. They're going to dedicate the walls. They're going to do things like our father David did. And what do? Oh, where is the family of Asaph and this musical family that praised God and worshiped God? First of all, during the time of David, we can account from 1,000 down to 444 faithfulness of this family worshiping and praising God. I've already given you the details just in highlights of this first one. And in David's time, Asaph was in charge of the music in the Lord's temple. And I want you to just let that sink in, because the structure, the magnificent structure of this temple that David has all of these supplies that he has brought together to help his son Solomon in building the temple. And when this temple is getting ready to be constructed in the life of Solomon, David has already appointed Asaph. And what a privilege that Asaph and his relatives are going to be in charge of the music. We're going to find that there's a man named Heman is going to be a relative. We're introduced to someone named Ethan, and we're going to see psalms of theirs at the very end of book chapter 3. And these singers are appointed, and you'll find in 1 Chronicles 15:19. The singers are Heman and Asaph and Ethan. And so here is Asaph and his fellow musicians, and they love to sing, and this is a part of what they're called to do, to serve and to worship God. We have two families at Eastside who are just very, very musical, the Holts and the Waltons, and they will oftentimes be singing on the recordings of Search. If a group of singers get together to record songs for a week, they're a part of that. Write songs, edit songs. The granddaughters play banjo, fiddle, mandolin, just a very, very musical family. And we see this with people that we know. And so every time I turn to the third book of Psalms and I come to the family of Asaph, then I just think, okay, here is the musical family of the Hebrew nation, and their great-grandfather, wherever you are generationally, Asaph, David appointed him to lead the worship. And so these men are given very specific responsibilities by David. And then secondly, when Solomon finally builds the temple, and this is a 7-year project, all the stones were cut, there was no noise that was made, very, very unusual building project, and probably millions of dollars of gold and supplies are brought together in the building of this structure called the temple. And we're going to find in 2 Chronicles 5 and verse 12, then the Levite singers were Asaph and Heman. I did not mention him earlier, but here's the first of our restoration movements, and this is going to be Jehoshaphat. There were probably about 3 or 4 kings after David that are worth their salt, and Jehoshaphat is one of those. And he is also going to lead a revival of worship, and we're going to find in 2 Chronicles 20, 14 through 23, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jehaziel, and then a Levite of the sons of Asaph. And so here we're going to be coming on 200 years later, and we have a record of them. When you come to King Hezekiah, and here's a sound alike that we did with our children. Hezekiah's father is Ahaz, and so you're going to kind of hear Ahaz, Hezekiah. Ahaz is my vote for the worst king in the southern kingdom. And an easy way to remember, again, I do this for 5-year-olds. Sorry, I don't want to insult your intelligence. But Ahaz is one letter off from Ahab. And we all can remember Ahab and Jezebel and how notoriously evil they are in the northern kingdom. Well, one of the worst kings in the southern kingdom is named Ahaz. And I just shudder. At some point, he nails the doors of the temple shut. And we just referred to this later, and I literally just kind of hold my head in kind of disbelief, and I think, how could a son of David, talking about great-great-grandson, how could a son of David and a king of Judah nail the doors of the temple shut? And I just shudder, because Asaph and his brethren can't sing before the ark of the Lord in the temple. We can't have the Passover. We can't kill the Passover lamb. We can't celebrate Pentecost. When we come to October, we cannot have the Day of Atonement at one-ment with God, where the priest goes into the Holy of Holies once a year. We can't have the Day of Atonement. We can't have the Feast of Booths and Tabernacles. And we're not told what they did, but during extended periods of ungodliness, the family of Asaph had to have some way to support themselves, because the normal stipulations of supporting the singers and those who served are all going to be disregarded. And so we don't know what kind of vocations that they had, but there are also going to be extended period of times where the temple is not functioning, and so they're not being supported to do that. And we don't know what they did to support themselves, but when those periods of time take place, Ahaz dies, and here comes this wonderful king, Hezekiah. And what's the first thing he does? Let's open the temple. Let's restore the temple. And when they restore the temple, and I'm in 2 Chronicles 29 and 30, Hezekiah commanded the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the singer, and they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed down and they worshiped. Then several years are going to go by, a period of time again of decline, and people are not going to be worshiping. And then the good king Josiah, he has a very short reign, but he's such a good king. And they have lost, and again, I just kind of hold my head. I just can't even hardly imagine. They have lost the book of the law. So here is the law that God gave through Moses, and we're down into the 640s, and no one knows where the book they have lost the scriptures. And so Josiah becomes king, and what does he do? Let's clean out the temple, let's restore the temple, let's rededicate the temple. And while they are cleaning out the temple, guess what happens? They find the book of the law. And when they start reading this, and you'll find this in 2 Chronicles 35, then they find out, oh, we're supposed to be having Passover. We're supposed to be having Pentecost. And so what does Josiah do? This is 35 and 15. He brings together the singers, the sons of Asaph who were in their place, according to the command of David and Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, the king's seer. And so here we are down into the 640s. David is 1,000. And when we have a restoration movement, when we clean out the temple, when we find the book of the law, what's the first thing we do is, where's the singers? Where's the family of Asaph? And these people are still faithful. The family is still worshiping, and they're brought together in the worship. The temple in Jerusalem is going to be destroyed in 3 different stages. Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in 606 the first time. He will come back a second time in 598, 597. We'll capture the city. But the third time, in 587, 586, then he tears down the walls, burns the temple, and destroys the temple. And as God told the prophet Jeremiah, the people would be in captivity for 70 years. They're in captivity, and then when we come to those wonderful books of Ezra and Nehemiah, then they start bringing Hebrews, God's people, back to Jerusalem. And in Ezra 2, verse 41, there were 128 singers who were the sons of Asaph. And so just get this picture in your mind. The whole city has been destroyed. The temple has been destroyed. Some of the people have been in captivity for 70 years, and they start bringing the people back. We're going to rebuild the temple. We're going to restore the worship. And among those who returned to Palestine are going to be 128 of the sons of Asaph in Ezra 21 and 14. And what does Ezra ask them to do? And this is chapter 3 and verse 10. He wants them to praise the Lord according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to God. And so here we are at the very end of the Old Testament, and we're going to do this like our father David did. And so what are we going to do? Where are the sons of Asaph? I still find this amazing that hundreds of years later, and listen to how I'm wanting to try to say this, they pass down a genetic gift for singing, but that genetic gift for singing is accompanied by a spiritual gift of faithfulness and worship and praise. And in spite of all the ups and downs and all the idolatry, the family of Asaph has remained faithful through all of these years. When you come to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 744, the singers, the sons of Asaph, at this point are going to be 148. So we don't know how many there were originally, but this is what is amazing to me, is that over a 600-year period of time, when we start looking for them, every time we're going to do this like our father David did this. Every time we're going to restore the worship of the temple. Every time we're going to keep the Passover. Every time we need a family to sing in the temple, guess who we get? The family of Asaph. And this is, to me, is just an amazing thing to trace the heritage and the history of these people. And I'm in Nehemiah 12 and 46. In the days of David and Asaph of old, there was a chief of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. I don't want to be too facetious, but let me do this in an American way. If the sons of Asaph got together for Thanksgiving, would you imagine that they sang when they got together? I'm not trying to be silly, but you think, here is this musical family, and can you imagine what family reunions are like? And this is why one of the things, we're going to talk about this in different ways, one of the things that I wanted to do, first of all, as a father and now as a grandfather, and I still love that term, fingerprints of faith, is that we need to teach our families to love and to enjoy the privilege of worship. Worship is not something that I have to do. Worship is a privilege of something that I get to do in order to give praise and honor to God. And here's my question, and I ask this first of all for myself, but for you as well. If Christ doesn't return for another 600 years, will there be anyone in your family, physical or spiritual, who will still be faithful in worshiping God 600 years from now? And that's something that always just kind of spurs me on. I would never use the word it haunts me, but it's in a positive way. And as I went through this spiritual treasure hunt to follow this family, and I didn't know where it was going to end, I had never noticed this ongoing practice of worship and praising God by this family. But here we are, and we can look back now through Scripture, and we can account for 6 centuries of faithfulness and godliness. And in my physical family, I'm the 4th generation. And obviously our son and daughters are 5th, our grandchildren are 6th. And one of the things that to me is a major commitment that we need to have is maintaining a spirit of faithfulness and worship. And that's something that's very, very important. And so I want to challenge those of us that are parents, grandparents, and I say grandparents in quotations. I have had a couple of opportunities to watch people who didn't have grandchildren in their local congregation, and so they adopted some of the boys or some of the kids that were in a local church, and they did things with them, and they worked with them and encouraged them. And so think about this. One of our greatest responsibilities is to teach the next generation both about God and to learn to worship and to love God. And you read this all the way through. I'm back in Genesis after they come out of the ark. The covenant I will make with future generations. Genesis 18:17. I've chosen Abraham that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. And we come to Deuteronomy 4 and then into chapter 6. Make this known to your children and your children's children. Teach them diligently to your children. You walk by the way, you sit in your house. Write these things on the doorpost of your house. Joshua, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Job, and I ask this question respectfully. At the end of the book of, at the first of the book of Job, we find that Job regularly offers sacrifices for his children. And I always wonder at the very end, did Job continue to do that at the very end? I would be surprised if he didn't. And one of the things that Job was always concerned about was the faithfulness of his children. But one of the things I found very interesting is that one of the Psalms of Asaph is Psalm chapter 78. And here's one of these great sections in the book of Psalms about our responsibility as parents and grandparents. And I thought, how interesting. Here is a psalm that is written by the musical family. And it reflects not only what they thought, but this is what they actually did. And notice a short reading. We will not hide them to the coming generation. This is the teaching of God. He commanded our fathers to teach to their children, that the next generation might know him. The children yet unborn, and arise to tell them to their children. And this is something that they were committed to, they were faithful in, and I'm sure worship was an important part of the faithfulness that was passed down through the generations. And something that I just noticed, virtually every time I finish the Old Testament, how does God end the Old Testament? We start with Adam and Eve, we start with the first family, all of these things in Genesis 1 and 2. And I'm now in Malachi 4 and verse 6. And God is about to be silent for 400 years. And what does he say? I want to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. And what an interesting way to close the Old Testament, the charge that this is something that's going to be between fathers and their children, and this challenge of faithfulness and doing this throughout all generations. A wonderful passage in John 6:45, Jesus simply says, "It is written in the prophets, they shall all be taught by God." And every time we teach, whether it's in our families, whether it's in a class, formal or informal, we are fulfilling something that was said by the prophet, something that Jesus encouraged. And everyone who has heard and has learned from the Father comes to me. Paul is going to say to us as fathers, raise your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And so in order to do that, I'd like to kind of summarize our thoughts today by these challenges. The first thing is that we need to be faithful all of our lives. If Asaph had been faithful for a while and fallen away, would there have been 600 years of faithfulness? And this is something that's very, very important. How you and I finish may be the most important thing that we teach our children. We also need to ask, not only will our personal family, will our children have faith, but we need to ask, will our faith have children? And the wonderful thing about the gospel is that we have a physical family, but we also have a spiritual family as well. When you look at the family of Asaph, worship is not a spectator sport. Worship is not something that they kind of come and go and they, are just lightly involved with. This part of worship and singing was a vital part of them. And the principles of faithfulness that is encouraged in Scripture is something that was practiced by this wonderful family for over 600 years. I love this expression in the book of Ephesians, and I use this a lot at funerals. Paul refers to God, and he says he is the Father for whom every family in heaven and on earth derives their name. And as centuries go by, decades go by, God has a family of his people in heaven, and then there's also a family of those of us that are on earth. And for those of us that are in multi-generation families, we need to be doing everything that we can, both in terms of the heritage of our family that's gone into heaven, but to help the next generations to join us and to join them. And that's true both of our physical families, and it's also true of our spiritual family. And that's why I think when we're in the church, we have the blessing of being a part of a forever family. As I mentioned last week, L.O. Sanderson came and did a devotional on his 75th birthday, and I did ask him two questions. One was the favorite line in his songs, but I also asked him a second question. I said, Brother Sanderson, outside of your hymns that you have written, what is your favorite line in the hymn book? And just like that, he said, oh, that's really easy. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun, from Amazing Grace. And I want to commend this to us and for us to think of this as a challenge. Here's this wonderful family of Asaph that for 600 years are faithful, they're worshiping, they're singing, they're serving, and this is something that they did on earth. But when we get to heaven and we enter into a sense of timeless, the song says, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And let's do all we can to increase the population of heaven in our day and our time.